Welcome, Specimen. Welcome to Thursday. We are now in the third week of 9.2, the first week of Mythic raiding, and because we are starting to get into the real meat of the patch, we're going to go and take a look at how last week has been when it comes to raiding. Now, I thought about making it about Mythic Plus as well, but there is quite a difference this tier. You know, usually when Heroic week ends, you're like, okay, fine, Heroic doesn't matter anymore, now let's start looking at Mythic. Let's start looking at how the specs are going to be performing in Mythic, etc, etc. But, you know, as I made my point in the raid difficulty video of a couple of days ago, it's unlikely that this week we are going to see many guilds double into Mythic in the first place. Certainly not the majority of the average guilds. They will very likely still be stuck progressing on Anduin, Rigel, on Lords of Dread, and the Jailer, assuming they will even bother trying to progress on the Jailer. So there is unlikely going to be much to look at in terms of Mythic progression this week. So it is more relevant to look at Heroic logs right now, whereas for Mythic Plus, we can wait a little bit longer, because unlike raiding, Mythic Plus right now is going to function as all of the other previous seasons. This is the week where the keys have no longer an item level lock. That is when, you know, more people are going to start dabbing into multiple Mythic Plus keys. We're going to be starting to see more data coming in the next few days, so we can wait a little bit longer for the Mythic Plus video. Instead, we can start and take a look at the raid one immediately. Let's just compare the stuff from this week, from the last week, the first week of Heroic, to what we had up to the last week, basically, of 9.1.5. If we have any differences in terms of popularity of the specs, who is playing what, as well as then the performance as well in the raid. Now, it's worth mentioning, as usual, that these results are mostly done without tier sets. There are going to be very, very few players with 4 pieces already, and still not too many people with 2 pieces of their tier sets, so it's not fully powered up yet, your class and your spec. Same goes for Double Legendary. These logs are still without the additional borrowed power of the second legendary. We start first with the popularity, just to see what the trend is right now in this first week of the raid, which specs did players go for. So when we look at the popularity and we compare it to the last week of 9.1.5, this is what we have. Now, it seems like a copy and paste immediately, because we see Beast Mastery Hunter, we see Balance Druid, and we see Havoc Demon Hunter at the top. More or less the same representation, basically, of these 3 specs. They haven't really changed too much. We see the first clear change in the gap between Frost and Fire. Frost was slightly ahead of Fire by the end of the last patch. Now Fire is, you know, significantly ahead of Frost Mage for the moment. There is another climb that we are seeing here, which is Demonology. Now it's the even more clear-cut choice for Warlock specs in the raid. It was already before, but now it's even more clear that it's a good choice. There is also a massive rise, as more or less expected, of Fury Warrior. We see that in 9.1.5, Arms was the to-go spec for Warrior, and now Arms is still not bad, it's still not completely fallen off compared to Fury, but definitely Fury Warrior has risen up the ranks, up to being actually at the moment the second most played melee DPS spec in the raid. We do have some other changes, but these are a little bit more minor. We see less Windwalker Monks compared to 9.1.5. We also see a few more, obviously, Enhancement Shamans. I am sure you have noticed recently, Enhancement has a pretty good, I would say, single target damage in the raid. It's bound to become stronger. It's one of the specs that synergizes quite a bit with the tier set pieces, together with their Double Legendary and their kit already, so it's bound to continue in this trend. Now, the bottom, on the other hand, is not too surprising, because at the bottom we do have Survival and Outlaw, and what a surprise, at the start of this patch, Outlaw and Survival are still at the bottom. I mean, if you want to have surprise, actually it's Survival who has overtaken Outlaw, so Outlaw now is the least played of the specs in the raid. And then you do have some other habitual visitors of the bottom of popularity. We have Feral Druid is still here, Affliction, Arcane are still there. You do also have Frost Death Knight, which is another not very popular spec. The biggest gap, I would say, is Assassination. because Assassination was matching slash fighting with Subtlety for being the better performing spec in the raid in the last patch. Instead, now there has been a significant gap. If we consider that Outlaw is still at the bottom, basically still not played too much, the very simple answer is that a significant chunk of Assassination rogues just went to play Subtlety. That's basically the difference, and the gap that Assassination has suffered at the start of this patch. As far as popularity, these are the major changes in the first week of Heroic. Some of these were quite expected, like Fire Mage back to doing better than Frost, or Enhancement being predicted to be doing quite well. Fury Warrior also was quite expected to be rising this much at the start of this patch. So not too many surprises, honestly, as far as popularity goes for the DPS. What about tanks and then healers? So when we look at tanks, we checked the first time a few days ago, but that was the preliminary look. What do we have now that the full week has gone by? So what do we have now that the full week has gone by is an even bigger gap. I pointed out before that there was starting to be a little bit of a divide between the top 3 specs for tanking in the raid, Brewmaster, Blood, and Prot Paladin, and the bottom 3, which were Vengeance, Guardian Druid, and Protection Warrior. Now the gap has gotten even wider. Now that we have the full numbers of 9.2 the first week, we do see basically twice as many. The top 3 are essentially twice as much represented as Vengeance and Guardian. At this point, I wouldn't even consider Prot Warrior as part of the bottom 3. I would say Prot Warrior is in the bottom 1. It's in a class of its own, unfortunately. But we do see Prot Paladin rising significantly compared to the last patch, and getting much closer to Blood and Brewmaster, and also the expected, loss of popularity of Vengeance Demon Hunter, which is a far cry. It's quite far away to its popularity that they had in the first tier of this expansion. One little point about Guardian. Guardian is a quite good tank. It's quite solid on all fronts, really. The problem is, as usual, that when it comes to tanks, you really want something extra, something more that they can give you. You have Brewmaster that gives you the debuff, and Windwalker, as we just saw, is not that popular. Mistweaver is not that popular, which means having a Brewmaster Monk is going to help a lot. We also have Blood Death Knight, which is very self-sufficient. It's pretty good for progression. It does have grips. With Abomination Limb as Necrolord, he has even more grips. It does help also that Unholy and Frost are not that popular, so it's a pretty good pick. Then you have Prot Paladin, which has tons of utility. Besides having clearly the most damage out of all tanks, they also have tons of utility, cheat mechanics like immunities, so it can help quite a bit. So Guardian Druid, while still being a quite solid tank, as we will see when we go over Mythic Plus, is still just fine. It does not bring much of anything else to the group, so there aren't too many incentives to bring a Guardian Druid in the raid. Now, talking about incentives to bring a spec, we do have a pretty good incentive recently to bring Holy Priest in the raid, because when we look at the healers, comparing them from the last patch, we do have a significant rise of Holy Priest. So, for the first time in what feels like months, if not over a year, actually, I would say, the top 2 has been broken. It's no longer Restoration Shaman and Holy Paladin. Now, it is worth mentioning that this is the largest gap, the largest difference between the most played healer and the second most played healer that we had the whole expansion. Resto Shaman was quite close to Holy Paladin, basically, for the entire run of Shadowlands. And now, in the first week of 9.2, this is a significant gap compared to what we are used to see. And even more surprising, of course, is that the gap is not actually to Holy Paladin, but to Holy Priest, which is now, at the moment, about 91 logs ahead of Holy Paladin. The result is, of course, that, this is not surprising, Discipline Priest, it's at the lowest it's ever been in Shadowlands, because, of course, more priests move to Holy. As a result, Discipline gets much less played. Restoration Druid and Mistweaver Monk are expected to be in the same position that they were before, so bottom 3, basically. That's their spot at the moment. Now, one thing worth mentioning about Holy Priests. Heroic is always very good for Holy Priests. Holy Priests scale very well with large numbers. The bigger the group, the better a Holy Priest is going to do. So once you go back to Mythic and you cut that 30-man raid or that 25-man raid down to 20, Holy Priest is bound to lose. value. Also, there are quite a few instances of rot damage in the raid, so consistent ticking damage over time, which is very, very good for a Holy Priest, for how a Holy Priest heals. So for now, it is benefiting the way the bosses are working are benefiting Holy Priest quite a bit. We have to see just how much this is going to change once we get into Mythic. We actually start getting some massive damage, which requires damage reduction, which requires a strong cooldown, which is usually where Discipline starts shining way more. So that's going to be interesting to see if this status quo of Holy Priest being massively more popular stays through Mythic, or if reverts back to what we are more used to, which is Discipline being the healer of choice when it comes to priests in raids. Now, once we have looked at the popularity, at what players have chosen in the first week, of course we can also take a look at the performance in the first week. Yes, DPS. People are going to be wanting to look at who is doing the most damage at the moment. So let's take a look and compare this to the last week of 9.1.5. So this is what we had by the end of the last patch. We pointed out, I will say this again, in case you have forgotten, you have the memory of a goldfish, that it was a melee dominant tier. Because as you can see here, you had all three rogue specs, you had Havoc, Demon Hunter, you had both of the warrior specs, and you had Windwalker Monk. So 8 of the top 9 specs were all melee. The only one that broke this combo was Balanced Druid. That was the state by the end of the last patch. In the first week of the new patch, in the top 9, just to stay in sync with 9.1.5, we have 8 melee DPS. The situation is exactly the same, because the only non-melee DPS spec, there is a change here, is no longer Balanced Druid, which we have pointed out was falling in the meters for the moment massively. The only one is Beast Mastery Hunter. Beast Mastery is the only one that breaks the combo of the melee dominance at the top. We do still have both of the warrior specs. They are higher than before. Before they were towards the 5th to 6th place, now they are actually top 3. We do have 2 out of 3 rogue specs. The only one that is not performing as well, still doing fine, but not as well, is Assassination Rogue. Also worth mentioning, just in case you were wishing to play Assassination, that Assassination has a very good double legendary combo and a quite decent tier set. So they are one of the specs that is bound to perform better as soon as they get their borrowed powers. We also do have changes, because outside of the same specs that we have seen before, the 2 warriors and the 2 rogues, we have some newcomers. Both of the Death Knight specs are actually here. It's funny because we just looked at the popularity and both of the Death Knight specs are not particularly popular. Unholy is in the middle of the pack while Frost is towards the bottom, yet they are showing to be some, decent performers at the moment. The other change, this is not surprising though, we looked at it already, is Enhancement. Enhancement is currently 4th. Previously, Enhancement was at the bottom, so this is far and away the largest gap in performance between one patch to the next at the moment. Enhancement essentially climbing, 22 ranks between patches. That's massive, that's gigantic. So these are the main newcomers in terms of performance at the moment, Enhancement and both of the DK specs together with Beast Mastery. These are the ones that have jumped the most in performance compared to the end of 9.1.5. But these are the positive ones. These are the positive jumps. What about the negative jumps at the moment? The ones that are not performing as expected, or not as expected, but rather as previous. So the first one is Havoc. Havoc was 3rd. It was challenging rogue specs continuously in 9.1.5. Now they have dropped 13 spots, 13 ranks. They are now middle of the pack, which is still solid. It's not something to be desperate about, but they're not as dominant as they were before. Another drop worth mentioning actually is to the Mage specs. Mage specs, interestingly enough, basically scale down for rankings altogether. And they did so at the same time. By the end of 9.1.5, the hierarchy of mages was Fire, and then Arcane, and then Frost. When we look at 9.2, it is still Fire, and then Arcane, and then Frost, but the difference is that they are now all simultaneously 4 to 5 ranks lower compared to the end of 9.1.5. Now, there are other specs that at the moment are roughly in the middle, like they were by the end of 9.1.5. Red Paladin is still loitering in the middle together with Demonology Warlock. Elemental Shaman is closer to the bottom than they were before, but it is still not a major change. We still have the old habitual bottom rankers like we have gotten for a while now, which is Destruction and Affliction Warlock. They are still there, they are not moving, and it's honestly kind of sad, because previously they were there with Enhancement, and now Enhancement left them to go to the top. They were also there with Beast Mastery, and now Beast Mastery left them to go back to the top. They were also there with Frost Death Knight, and Frost Death Knight left them as well. They were the only two that remained at the bottom from one patch to the next without too many changes. They have been joined, however, they have been joined by Balanced Druid. Okay, so this is not too meaningful at the moment. As we said in the popularity, for example, Balanced Druid is amongst the most popular of the spec, and yet it's towards the bottom. Why are so many people playing Havoc when Havoc is middle of the pack? Okay, this is not too indicative of the current performance of all the specs. First of all, because it's heroic. Second of all, because not everyone, or not most people, have the tier sets to power them up even more, and of course nobody has the double legendary. So it doesn't mean that this is what we will see for the entirety of the patch. Not to mention, these logs are only going to show the bosses that have been defeated, which means most of the logs are going to go from the first boss to the 6th to 7th boss. Very few logs of Anduin, and basically almost no logs of the last 3 bosses, so we don't even have the full picture of the heroic bosses. You have seen, if you have watched my videos, how much this overall damage can change when you jump from a pure single target boss to an AoE boss. Back in Sanctum, we showed the examples of what happened when guilds started going past Painsmith Raznal, or getting past Soul Render, or even Face Scribe, or even Kel'Thuzad, because they had such heavy AoE periods. Suddenly, specs that were middle of the pack to bottom tier, like Elemental, like Windwalker, like Affliction, all jumped at the top of the rankings for a few weeks. And that's because AoE heavy fights allowed them to do tons of damage, which showed in the overall meters. So killing all of the bosses in heroic is also going to be relevant just to see how the damage profile is going to look. You know, at the moment, heavy AoE specs like Elemental Shaman, consistent AoE specs like Frost, or burst AoE specs like Affliction are all towards the bottom. Perhaps as we get deeper into the progression with some heavy fights, Anduin in particular is heavily focused on add damage, so perhaps as we get deeper into the bosses and the logs of the boss kills, we get to see even more of a shift. But this is what we have for the moment. For the first week of heroic, this is more or less the picture. As I said, this is good to look at the moment, so that we can then go and see as players progressively get more tier pieces, the 2-piece bonus and then the 4-piece bonus, and then in 2 more weeks you do get the second legendary piece. So we will be able to see the progression of performance with more borrowed powers. That the more you acquire, how do you change in your performance compared to your, I guess, vanilla, your clean version at the start of the patch, when you don't really have any of the new patch borrowed powers with you. So it's a cool little snapshot that we will be able to revisit in the future. We will continue to monitor this heroic week. I'm still refusing to call this mythic week, because it's not a mythic week if nobody actually goes into fucking mythic, okay? So we will continue to monitor this second heroic week to see how things are progressing as more guilds get more logs of later bosses, etc, and how things will change. As I said, we are keeping the Mythic Plus recap for a little bit later on, because unlike Mythic Raiding, which is paused basically for the moment, Mythic Plus definitely is not. Plenty of people will be diving this week in Mythic Plus for the fully unlocked item level rewards of the keys, so we are bound to have even more logs, even more results in the next few days. Not to mention, you do have now the quest, the weekly quest. Completing 4 mythic dungeons is going to give you a heroic piece of the raid, so also very important to do. So we're gonna be wait a little bit more for the Mythic Plus review, but this was the one for the raid for the first week. Let me guys know what you think about this. Perhaps you've been surprised by a few of the picks, perhaps you have been sleeping under a rock and you had no idea that Enhancement Shaman was going to do this good, or perhaps that Beast Mastery Hunter was actually a spec in the raid, or maybe you expected all of this or most of this. Maybe you have some secret picks you are waiting to reveal for Mythic Week. Maybe you think there is some sleeper spec that is going to perform quite well in Mythic. Let me guys know. So stopping here on this Thursday, of course, thank you for watching the video and for helping to grow and support the channel. You can participate in this effort even more by liking and commenting on the video down below, as well as, of course, subscribing to the channel. But this time around, the subscription button is going to be unlocked for the DPS in the top half of this picture. You can also, if you don't mind, you can also follow me on Twitter over here, as well as supporting me on Patreon over here, giving you access to my Discord server. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, of course, I don't get a tier piece in my Great Vault. Of course, I don't get a tier piece from boss kills. Why would I, right? Why?